On the night of July 15th, inside a private study on the third floor of the Apostolic Palace, Pope Leo XIV sat alone. His phone was face down on the desk. On the screen, 37 missed calls. He didn't pick up a single one because what he was about to say to the world would make every one of those calls irrelevant. 3 cardinals had already tried to stop him. 2 senior advisors had resigned in protest just hours earlier. And somewhere in a Roman apartment, a theologian who had served the Vatican for 22 years was drafting a public letter calling the Pope a traitor. None of it mattered. Leo had made his decision. And by dawn, neither the progressives nor the traditionalists would forgive him. Before continuing with the story, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Your support means everything and keeps these stories alive. It started 4 days earlier, July 11th. The Pope was still in Spain, the final leg of his week-long apostolic journey. He had been to Madrid, Barcelona, and the Canary Islands. He had met the King and Queen. He had addressed the Spanish Parliament for the first time in papal history. He had visited migrants at a center in Tenerife. And through all of it, one question kept following him like a shadow. Every press conference, every interview request, every shouted question. From behind a barricade, will you ordain women? He had dodged it politely, strategically. Every time a journalist raised the issue, Leo offered the same rehearsed response. The Church values women. The Church needs women. The role of women must continue to develop. But he never went further. He never gave a yes. He never gave a firm no. He left just enough ambiguity to keep both sides hoping and both sides furious. But something happened on the flight back to Rome on July 12th that changed everything. Something that broke the careful silence Leo had been maintaining for over a year. The papal. The plane had just left Tenerife. It was late. The Spanish king had lent his own aircraft for the return flight after a technical issue grounded the original plane. Leo sat near the front. His press secretary sat across the aisle. A small group of journalists occupied the rear cabin. Most of they already have stories about the Spain trip. The questions were supposed to be about immigration, about the Sagrada Familia, about euthanasia in Europe. Routine, controlled. The Pope's press secretary had already screened the questions. Safe topics only. That was the deal. Everyone on that plane had agreed. But agreements in the world of Vatican journalism are made to be broken. Then a journalist from a French outlet raised her hand. She was young, new to the beat. She hadn't been warned about the unwritten rules of a papal flight. Or maybe she had been warned and didn't care. She didn't ask about migration. She didn't ask about Barcelona. She asked a question that cut through the cabin like a blade. Your Holiness. In April, you prayed publicly with Archbishop Sarah Mali, the first female Archbishop of Canterbury. A woman who holds a position your church says women cannot hold. You embraced her. You called her a sister in faith. If a woman can lead millions of Anglicans, why can she not serve at the altar of the Catholic Church? The cabin went silent. Leo's press secretary shifted in his seat. The standard protocol for these moments was simple. Deflect, acknowledge the question, pivot to sodality, to dialogue, to ongoing study. That was the script. That was what every advisor had drilled into him. But Leo didn't follow the script. He looked at the journalist for a long moment. Then he said 5 words that would later be described as the most dangerous sentence a pope had spoken in decades. That is the right question. Not an answer, not a policy change, not a doctrinal shift. Just 5 words, but they landed like a bomb. Within 2 hours, those 5 words were on every major news site in the world. Translation spread across 40 languages. Catholic Twitter erupted. Progressive organizations declared it a breakthrough. Conservative commentators called it a scandal. Vatican analysts scrambled to interpret what he meant. Was it a signal, a slip, a deliberate move? By midnight, time 3 hashtags related to the Pope's comment were trending globally. A retired archbishop in Philadelphia went on American television and called it the most reckless thing a pontiff said since Vatican II. A feminist theologian in Paris called it the first honest sentence a pope has spoken about women in the 21st century. Both of them were wrong, and both of them were right. Inside this Vatican, the reaction was far more controlled and far more dangerous. By the time the plane landed at Fiumicino Airport, 2 things had already happened. First, the Vatican press office issued a clarification stating that the Pope's remark was a reflection on the value of open questions, not a policy statement. Second, 3 curial officials had already scheduled an emergency meeting for the following morning. The topic was listed on the internal agenda as pastoral, communication strategy. Everyone knew what that actually meant: damage control. But here is what nobody outside that the Vatican understood. Those 5 words were not spontaneous. Leo had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and the real story, the one no began in late May, right after the release of his first encyclical Magnifica, Humanitas. The document focused on artificial intelligence, on technology, on human dignity in the digital age. It was ambitious, it was well received, but buried inside that encyclical in a paragraph that almost nobody noticed at first was a single line that would later become the most controversial sentence in modern Catholic history. The line read, "The dignity of every baptized person demands that no charism, no calling, no service to the Church be dismissed without discernment, simply on the basis of tradition alone." It sounded vague, intentionally so. But inside the Vatican, the people who mattered understood exactly what it meant. Leo was laying the groundwork not for a revolution, not for a sudden reversal of doctrine, but for a conversation that the Church had spent decades avoiding. A senior professor at the Gregorian University read that sentence 3 times the day the encyclical was published. Then he called a colleague and said 2 words, "He's moving." The colleague asked what he meant. The professor replied, "Read paragraph 94 again slowly." He just separated tradition from revelation in a single breath. That is not an accident. Within days, Catholic intellectual circles were buzzing. Academic papers began circulating, not publicly, not in journals, through private email chains, through encrypted messaging groups that senior theologians used to discuss matters they couldn't raise in official settings. The question was simple. Was Leo signaling a doctrinal shift, or was he simply restating what the Church had always taught in language that sounded more radical than it was? The answer, as it turned out, was both. And that conversation was about women. The signals had been building for months. In October of the previous year, Leo had spoken at the Jubilee of Senate Ultimes. He told a story about his mother, how in the 1970s, when debates about gender equality were emerging in America, he had asked her if she wanted equality with men. She had laughed and said no because women were already better. The crowd laughed too. But then Leo turned serious. He spoke about nuns in Peru who baptized, who presided at marriages, who carried out missionary work in places no the priest would go. He praised them. He elevated them. And then he said something that sent a chill through every conservative cardinal watching. Perhaps we need a new understanding of leadership, power, authority, and service in the Church. That was October. By December, things escalated further. Leo ordered the release of a report from the Patrici Commission, a group established by Pope Francis to study whether women could be ordained as deacons. The commission had voted against it 5-5 on a key doctrinal statement and 7-1 against ordination in an earlier session. The door, it seemed, was closed. But Leo did something unusual. He released the full report. Every vote, every dissenting opinion, every argument for and against. No pope had ever made that kind of internal deliberation public before. And he did it without comment. No statement, no endorsement, no rejection. He simply let the world see the debate. The silence was deafening. Conservative media celebrated. The commission had ruled against women deacons. Case closed. But progressive theologians noticed something the conservatives missed. Leo hadn't endorsed the conclusion. He hadn't said. The matter was settled. He had simply shown the evidence and walked away. In Vatican politics, that kind of silence is never accidental. Then came the meeting with Archbishop Mullally in April, the first female Archbishop of Canterbury, a woman who led the Anglican Communion, a woman whose very existence as a religious leader represented everything. The Catholic Church had spent centuries rejecting, and Leo met her. He prayed with her publicly in front of cameras. Vatican historians noted that previous popes had met with female religious leaders before. Francis met with a female Lutheran archbishop in Sweden. He invited an Anglican woman bishop into a private meeting of his cardinal advisors. But Leo went further. He prayed alongside Mullally in a way that suggested equality, mutual respect, shared authority. It was, as one theologian put it, a visual revolution. And still, Leo said nothing definitive about women priests. He acknowledged that new problems had been added to historically divisive issues between Catholics and Anglicans. He pledged to continue dialogue, but he gave no answer. No position. No clarity until that plane ride from Spain. That is the right question. Now back to July 15th, 3 days after the plane incident. Leo was back in Rome. The Vatican was in chaos, not the visible kind. No protest in St. Peter's Square. The chaos was internal behind closed doors and whispered conversations between cardinals who had spent their entire careers protecting the doctrine that ordination was reserved for men. The problem wasn't just what Leo had said. It was what he was about to do. Word had leaked through a source inside the Secretariat of State that Leo was preparing a new apostolic exhortation. Not an encyclical, not a commission report, an exhortation, a personal teaching document. And its subject was the role of women in the Catholic Church. The draft was being written in secret. Only 3 people had seen it: the Pope himself, his personal theologian, a Peruvian Augustinian who had been with him since his days in Chio, and a canon lawyer from Chicago who specialized in sacramental theology. That was it. No cardinals, no curial officials, no committee. When senior members of the Curia learned about the document, the reaction was immediate and fierce. Cardinal Gardmiller, the former head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, made a private call to 3 other cardinals. His message was blunt. If this exhortation says what I think it says, we have a crisis of legitimacy on our hands. Another cardinal based in Africa took a different approach. He called the Vatican's Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith directly and demanded to know whether the Pope had consulted them before drafting the exhortation. The answer was no. Leo had bypassed the entire doctrinal apparatus. He had written the document outside the normal channels, outside the safeguards, outside the centuries-old system, designed to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral theological statement. That decision alone was enough to send shockwaves through the Curia. Popes had broad authority, but broad authority exercised in secret without consultation felt to many like something closer to defiance than governance. But what exactly did the exhortation say? That was the question, tearing the Vatican apart, because nobody outside Leo's, the inner circle, knew the full contents. All they had were fragments, rumors, a phrase here, a sentence there, leaked through intermediaries who had heard, second-hand accounts from people who claimed to have read portions. One fragment reportedly from the opening section read, "The exclusion of women from ordained ministry has been affirmed by tradition, but tradition is not the same as revelation, and it is revelation, not tradition, that binds us." If that sentence was real, it was explosive because it drew a line between 2 things the Church had always treated as inseparable: sacred tradition and divine revelation. To suggest they were different, that tradition could be wrong while revelation remained true, was to open a door that every previous pope had been kept sealed. Another fragment, reportedly from a later section, addressed the priesthood directly. The Church does not ordain women to the priesthood. This teaching has been held consistently and firmly. I do not intend to change it. Conservatives read that and exhaled, but they exhaled too soon because the next sentence, the one that followed immediately after, was the one that changed everything. However, the diaconate is not the priesthood, and the question of whether women may as deacons has not been definitively resolved by the magisterium. In other words, Leo was doing something no pope had ever done. He was splitting the question. He was saying no to women priests, firmly, clearly, permanently, but he was leaving the door open for women deacons. Not endorsing it, not ordering it, but refusing to close the door. And that middle path, that precise surgical cut between 2 positions, was exactly why neither side would forgive him. For progressives, it wasn't enough. They had been fighting for full ordination, priests, bishops, cardinals. They wanted equality in every sacramental role. They wanted what the Anglicans had, what the Lutherans had, what dozens of Protestant denominations had achieved decades ago. A half measure on deacons was to them an insult wrapped in a concession, a crumb from a table that should have been set for them. For conservatives, it was too much. The diaconate was the first step of holy orders. If women could be deacons, the theological barrier to the priesthood would crumble. It was, in their view, a Trojan horse, a calculated move to dismantle 2,000 years of doctrine through incremental erosion. Today, deacons, tomorrow, priests, eventually bishops. The slippery slope they had warned about for decades. Leo knew all of this. He understood the fury that was coming from both directions. He had calculated it, measured it, anticipated every objection before it was raised. That was who he was. The former head of the Augustinian order, a man who had governed religious communities across 4 continents, a canon lawyer with 2 advanced degrees from the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas. He didn't make statements by accident. He didn't choose words carelessly, and he didn't care about being popular. On the morning of July 16th, Leo called a private meeting. Not in the formal audiences hall, not in the Senate hall, in the chapel of the Dismart, the Vatican guest house where he still lived, just as Francis had before him. He had never moved into the grand papal apartments. He preferred the simplicity, the proximity to other people, the lack of ceremony. 7 people were invited. 3 cardinals, 2 theologians, a canon lawyer, and 1 woman. Sister Maria Elena Gutierrez, a Peruvian nun who had spent 30 years working in indigenous communities in the Amazon. She had been one of the delegates at the Senate on sodality. She had spoken openly about women's ministry. She had been criticized for it, threatened, marginalized by her own religious order for being too vocal. Leo had met her once before in Lima years ago when he was still the Bishop of Chico. She had come to him with a problem, a parish with no priest, a community with no access to sacraments, children who had never been baptized because the nearest the ordained minister was 200 kilometers away. She had asked him a simple question. If God calls me to serve, why does the Church tell me I cannot? He had not answered her then. He remembered that he carried it. For years, that question had lived inside him like a splinter he couldn't remove, not because he didn't know the theological answer. He knew it perfectly. He had taught it. He had defended it. He had written academic papers explaining why the Church's position was consistent and coherent. But knowing the answer and believing the answer were two different things. And the older he got, the wider the gap between them grew. Now, in that Leo addressed the group, his voice was low, measured. He spoke for less than 10 minutes, but what he said would leak within hours and reshape the global conversation about women in the Catholic Church. "I have heard the voices," he began. "I have heard of the women who feel rejected. I have heard the theologians who say the door is closed. I have heard the cardinals who warn me that any movement will split the Church. I have heard all of it." He paused. "But I have also heard the silence. The silence of the woman in the Amazon who buries the dead, leads her community in prayer every Sunday, but cannot break the bread. The silence of the sister who has given her life to the Church and has told her vocation as a sealing." He looked at Sister Maria Elelena. "That silence is louder than all the arguments." Then he said the words that would define his papacy. "The priesthood is reserved for men. I affirm this. I believe this. This is not my teaching to change. It belongs to the constant tradition of the Church and the teaching of my predecessors. I will not break it." The conservatives in the room nodded relief. "But the diaconate," Leo continued, "is a different question, and I will not allow fear to close a question that the Church herself has never definitively answered." He announced that he would establish a new commission, not another study group, not another academic exercise, a commission with binding authority, a commission that would within 18 months deliver a final recommendation on whether women could be admitted to the permanent diaconate. And he made one thing clear. This commission would not be composed entirely of men. "If we are discussing the calling of women," he said, "women must be at the table, not as observers, not as consultants, as members with full voice and full vote." The room was silent. Cardinal Miller, who had not been invited to this meeting but learned of its contents within the hour, issued a statement before sunset. He called the commission unnecessary and dangerous. He said the question had already been answered by the Patriarch Commission. He warned that reopen the debate was to undermine the integrity of holy orders. But Leo had anticipated this too. In a move that surprised even his closest advisors, Leo released the text of his chapel remarks to Vatican News that same evening. Not a summary, not a press release, the full text, word for word. He wanted no interpretation, no spin, no filtered version. He wanted the world to hear exactly what he said. No more, no less. The reaction was immediate and global. In the United States, the Women's Ordination Conference released a statement within 90 minutes. They acknowledged the reaffirmation that women could not be priests. They expressed deep disappointment, but they called the Diaconate Commission a crack in a wall we have been pushing against for 50 years. Their tone was cautious, hopeful, but wounded. In Germany, where the Catholic Church had been waging its own internal battle over reform through the cited way, the response was sharper. The president of the Central Committee of German Catholics called Leo's position courageous but incomplete. Progressive German bishops praised the commission. Conservative German bishops condemned it. In Africa, the reaction was different altogether. Several bishops' conferences issued statements supporting the Pope. In communities where women already led parishes and everything but name, the idea of a formalized diaconate felt like recognition of what was already happening on the ground. In Latin America, where Leo had spent most of his life, the response was deeply personal. Nuns and religious women who had served for decades in forgotten corners of the continent began recording video messages. They didn't talk about theology. They talked about their lives, about the communities they served, about the children they baptized in rivers because no priest would come, about the funerals they presided over because death doesn't wait for ordination. Those videos spread across social media faster than any Vatican statement. By the evening of July 16th, something unprecedented was happening. The debate had broken free of its usual containers. It was no longer confined to theologians and bishops and Vatican watchers. It was everywhere, on morning talk shows and opt pages, on podcasts hosted by people who had never discussed Catholic doctrine before. The question of women in the Church had become almost overnight the most talked about religious issue in the world. And it was personal. That was what made it different from previous debates. Previous Vatican controversies had been abstract, doctrinal disputes about sacramental theology, arguments about canonical interpretation, important to insiders, invisible to everyone else. But this was about people, about women that other women knew, about mothers and sisters and daughters who had grown up in the Church, served the Church, loved the Church, and been told by the Church that their service had limits. A hashtag began trending across Latin America. It translated roughly to, "My calling has no ceiling." Within 24 hours, it had been used over 2 million times, and what no one expected happened next. On July 17th, 2 days after the chapel meeting, something remarkable occurred during the Pope's weekly general audience in St. Peter's Square. Leo had just returned from Spain. The audience was focused on his reflections about the trip, about immigration, about the Sagrada Familia, about the young migrants he had met in the Canary Islands. But during the open greeting session at the end, a woman approached the papal platform. She was a theologian from Boston, an academic who had written extensively about women's ministry. She had a credential that allowed her close access. She reached the platform. Leo extended his hand. She took it. And then she said something that the microphones caught. "Holy Father, thank you for not closing the door." Leo held her hand. He looked at her, and in a voice that the nearest cameras recorded, he replied, "I did not open it either. I simply said it was never locked." That sentence exploded across the internet. It was quoted on the floor of the European Parliament. It was cited in theological journals within days. It was printed on protest signs by both supporters and opponents because it captured the essence of what Leo was doing. He wasn't changing doctrine. He wasn't defying tradition. He was challenging the assumption that the question had been settled. He was saying that what everyone assumed was a locked door was actually a door that had never been tested, and that distinction between a closed door and an untested one was the most destabilizing thing a pope could say. Back inside the Vatican, the pressure was mounting from every direction. On one side, a coalition of conservative cardinals began circulating a private letter. The letter called for an extraordinary consisti, a formal meeting of all cardinals to discuss the pope's actions. They argued that the establishment of a new commission with binding authority overstepped papal prerogative. They said the question of women deacons had been studied twice and answered twice. To reopen it was, in their words, an act of institutional recklessness. The letter reportedly had 14 signatures by the evening of July 17th, and 2 more were expected by morning. This was serious. An extraordinary consistory had not been called in opposition to a sitting pope in modern memory. The closest precedent was the dubia, the formal questions of doubt that a group of cardinals had sent to Pope Francis in 2016 over his teachings on divorce and communion. But that had been a polite theological challenge. This was something more aggressive. This was an institutional confrontation. Leo was informed of the letter at 8 in the evening. His reaction, according to someone present, it was a single sentence. 14 signatures is not a schism, it is a conversation. Then he returned to his work. On the other side, progressive organizations were already positioning the commission as insufficient. A coalition of Catholic women's groups from 12 countries issued a joint statement demanding that the commission also consider the priesthood. They argued that limiting the discussion to the diaconate was itself a form of exclusion, a way of acknowledging women's calling while still placing a ceiling on it. Leo was being attacked from both flanks simultaneously with equal ferocity, but he did not waver, he did not clarify, he did not soften, he did not harden. He simply held his position like a man standing in a doorway, refusing to step forward or back. That night, back in his room at the Doi Sancte Marte, Leo sat at his desk, the same desk where this story began. His phone still face down. The missed calls are now numbering over 100. Emails flooding in from every corner of the Catholic world. Requests for interviews, demands for clarification, pleas from allies, and threats from opponents. He opened his laptop. He pulled up the draft of the Apostolic Exhortation. It was almost finished. 43 pages, written partly in English, partly in Spanish, partly in the precise Latin that only a canon lawyers could love. It would not be released for months. It would go through revisions. It would be reviewed by canonists and theologians. But the core argument would remain unchanged. Women could not be priests. That door was not his to open. But the diaconate was an open question, and an open question deserved an honest answer, not a political one. He typed one final sentence at the bottom of the draft, a sentence that would later appear as the closing line of the published document, a sentence that captured everything he believed about the Church, about women, about truth, and about the terrifying responsibility of leading 1 billion souls through an age of uncertainty. The Church does not fear questions. She fears the silence that comes when we stop asking them. He saved the document. He closed the laptop. He turned off the light. For a long moment he sat in the dark, listening to the sounds of the building around him, footsteps in the hallway, the distant hum of an air conditioner, the faint bells of a church somewhere beyond the Vatican walls. He thought about his mother in Chicago, the woman who had told him, half joking and half serious, that women were already better. She had died years ago before he became a cardinal, before he became pope, before any of this. But her voice was still the clearest one in his head, clearer than the cardinals, clearer than the theologians, clearer than the 2,000 years of tradition that pressed down on his every single day. He thought about Sister Maria Elena, about the river baptisms, about the communities that had no priest and never would, about the women who served anyway without title, without recognition, without a place in the official structure of the church they had given their lives to. He thought about the French journalist on the plane, about the theologian in St. Peter's Square, about the 14ths, cardinals and their letters, about the 2 million hashtags in Latin America, about all of it. And he realized something that he would never say publicly because a pope cannot say everything he thinks. He realized that the question of women in the church was not really a question about theology. It was a question about fear of change, fear of losing control, fear of admitting that the church in its long and complicated history might have gotten something wrong. Not the gospel, not the faith, not the core truth of Christ's message, but the interpretation, the application, the human decision about who gets to carry that message forward. That fear was real. He felt it himself. Every pope does. The weight of 2 millennia of precedent is not easy to carry, and it is even harder to question. But Leo had spent his life in places where fear was a luxury people could not afford. In the mountains of Peru, in the parishes of Chicago, in the dusty roads of the Amazon. In those places, what mattered was not who was authorized to serve. What mattered was who showed up. And the people who showed up more often than not were women. Outside, Rome was still awake. The streets around the Vatican hummed with tourists and pilgrims and protesters and believers and skeptics and all the beautiful chaos of a city that had been the center of faith for 2,000 years. Inside, a 70-year-old man from Chicago sat in the dark, knowing that tomorrow the world would demand something he could not give. A simple answer, a clean resolution, a victory for one side and a defeat for the other. But Leo had never believed in simple answers. He believed in the right questions. And the question of women in the church, their calling, their dignity, their service, their voice was the right question. He had said so on a plane. He had said so in a chapel. He had said so to a woman in St. Peter's Square. And now alone in the silence, he said it once more to no one, to everyone, to the God he had served since the day he was ordained as a young Augustinian priest in Rome 44 years ago on a July morning, not unlike this one. That is the right question. And neither side would forgive him for asking it. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it challenged something you believed, and then do one thing right now. Subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment telling us where you stand, because this conversation is far from over. The next chapter may be even more shocking than this.